you guys have any famous, wow, I guess, I don't know how famous your traditions are. Mine's not enough to make the news by any means. But maybe you guys have some family traditions that you love to do. And adults, it applies for traditions. Over here, adults, over here. Phones on me. Okay. I know, I was looking at different traditions, and today we've been doing different Did You Know, and look at different elements of the Christmas story. And you might be able to guess what we are focusing on today, which is the wise men, right? And there's a bunch of traditions. My family, we never really did a lot with the wise men growing up, but I know that in certain cultures and certain families, they have what they call the Epiphany, right? Did I pronounce that right? I don't even celebrate it, so I don't even know, right? But really, that Epiphany is celebrating the visit of the wise men, and they celebrate it on January 6th. Very good. I can tell some of you don't celebrate it because you're like, I have no idea. And actually, if you start counting on Christmas Day, that's where we get the 12 days of Christmas, because if you count all the days, you end up on January 6th. Now, in different cultures, they actually have a number of different traditions. And one of them that they do is in Spain, the kids receive presents from 3 wise men. They don't receive any presents from Santa, but the wise men. And I'm like, only 3 presents. That could help the budget. No, right? In New Orleans, in Mexico, they actually bake the special bread or the cake, and they put inside of it a figurine of Jesus. So that when you're looking for the cake, you might get the slice with the Jesus figurine inside. Or another one, a number of countries, they dive into icy waters. That's a good tradition, right? In fact, in Istanbul, they actually throw in a wooden cross that they retrieve. In Prague, they jump in wearing only trunks and crowns to represent the wise men that came. So where's Jamie? New tradition at Eterno? All right, he says yes. We could do that. But there's many, many traditions that we have at Christmas. And one of them I said just a little bit earlier to the kids is reading through the nativity story, starting in Luke chapter 2 and reading all the way through to the verse where it says that Mary pondered these things in her heart. And when we have the nativity scene, who's usually present? Now, some of you are quickly looking over here to see if you can find the answer. But usually, who's present at the nativity scene? Yeah, the wise men are there, right? They made really good time if you think about it, right? But no, you have the shepherds, you have Mary and Joseph, baby Jesus, cattle, camels. You have the star often, and then you have the wise men. But when did the wise men come? Well, it's not actually certainly on the day that Jesus was born. But they followed the star that appeared, and they traveled many miles to the place where Jesus lay. And so today we're going to look at this as they followed the star. We're going to ask this question. Wise men, did you know the star you followed would lead you to the true King? So if you haven't, turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2. We're going to start at verse 1. Matthew chapter 2, looking at verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Now, as we open up this Did You Know, we want to make sure we keep the record straight, right? Especially for, the grumpy people in the room, right? The detail people, which I tease about it. Because actually the song we did, The Wise Men, it says, we 3 kings. I joked around with Wes, like, can't we just say, like, we the kings? Instead of we drop out number 3. Because why? Keeping the record straight. More than likely, there is more than 3 wise men. In fact, why is there 3? Well, it's most closely associated to just the 3 gifts. It actually traces back to the 6th and 7th century church tradition. In fact, here is a painting from late in the 6th century that they actually have of the 3 wise men bringing 3 gifts to the king. And some people even went so far to have them represent different individuals. They actually named specific people. And then some have said, well, these 3 wise men represent different areas, different continents, different regions, but really it's just tradition. We don't know how many wise men, and probably most likely there is more than 3. But I also take the pragmatic interpretation of why there's 3 wise men, because they probably could only find 3 kids that were willing to dress up. And I think that's probably the valid reason. No, right? But also this, that they likely showed up at a house. That night, when the angel appeared to the shepherd, they weren't there present. Instead, that was the night that they saw a star, and there was probably some conversing that went back and forth. They're probably getting some of their luggage together in order to make the trip, and there was probably planning that happened. And most likely, even if you're booking it, it would take 19 to 28 days in order to get from probably wherever they were located to where Jerusalem was. And also the language changes it to saying it's a house. Though mangers, sometimes people lived in them, and that's very possible. They lived with their animals. But there's a change from the wording of infant to child. And the fact that later on, the rest of the story, we see King Herod actually targeting those that were age 2 and under, actually would suggest that there was a time period that actually went by. And also likely it wasn't kings. We know it wasn't kings, but they're likely learned, that's a real word, learned astrologers or teachers, or even magicians, or people that they could interpret dreams, or even perhaps even physicians. But they were most assuredly not kings. Most likely from either Babylon, Persia, or Arabia. And they would study the stars to determine the future. And they also learned the teachings of other cultures. That's why they were aware of the teachings of the Jewish people that talked about this star taking place. And so you may say, well, how did they come to know these things? Well, there's different, actually, Jewish populations throughout the different area. And so it's perhaps that they just learned these traditions from that. Or even they could have learned from Daniel, when he was taken by Nebuchadnezzar. And it says, in fact, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 20, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of him, he found them, meaning Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 10 times better than all the magicians, the exact same word that we understand of magi, and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And also, if that was the case, they picked this up from Daniel. In Daniel chapter 7, he spoke at length about the Messiah, about the King of the Jews. And they're most assuredly aware of Numbers 24:17, which says this: I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. And perhaps even taking into account Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. See, they were aware of these passages, and as a result, they got into a caravan, they all traveled together, and they followed the great light to Jerusalem. And I guarantee you, this was hard not to notice. It certainly raised questions, and it certainly would draw attention. You wonder what kind of fanfare was present, like when they saw this group of people of donned in rich clothing traveling across the way, why they're coming to Jerusalem, why were they showing up? Actually, this past, I think maybe about 10 days ago, I'm not sure if you knew, but there was a major news network actually in town. And they're actually doing a piece for Fox News, and they were actually covering what a wonderful life. And they're down at Seneca Falls. I couldn't even imagine. I wasn't there, but I imagine when the crews are there, people are like, what's going on? What's happening? What's taking place? And it drew all these questions about why is this news network, why are they in our town? Of course, probably Christmas time and knowing the background to A Wonderful Life, Seneca Falls, they probably put those different pieces together. But here you have these individuals coming into town, drawing attention and saying, what are they doing? Why are they here? Well, they're looking. What are they looking for? The King of the Jews. They made their intention known, that they came to worship him. And this idea of worshiping is that they came to bring him homage. They came to show him reverence, to kiss his hand. And most likely it was a sincere concept, right? That this was a grand display that they saw written down about a star, and they were marveling at it. But that being said, they most likely held on to many religious beliefs. And Judaism and Christianity was just one of them that they marveled at, but didn't recognize the truth of the message that was behind it. And the fact is that Judaism during that time was, of course, and it is monotheistic, that separated it from all the other cultures all around. But notice, though, in this account that there's another player. It says, days of Herod the king. And this certainly would have caught the attention of the king. In fact, we know that it does on this passage. Now, it doesn't state it, but maybe perhaps Herod was even like a little bit initially flattered by the fact of these kings coming in, these wise men coming in and wondering perhaps why they're here for. And almost in my mind, I wonder if there's a similar scenario that played out, if you're familiar with the book of Esther. Right? When Haman, the king awoke him and said, I haven't been able to sleep, and I want to know what should I do for this person that I want to esteem, that I want to lift up. And Haman got really, really flattered until he realized it wasn't about him, but of one he despised, Mordecai. And you almost wonder if King Herod was flattered that this entourage of people were coming into town. They're here to see the king. But then they're like, no, the king born of the Jews. And then all of a sudden his heart sunk, realizing that they weren't actually looking for him, because they're here and they're searching for that was truly the king of the Jews. Because Herod, historically, he wasn't born king of the Jews. Instead, they were looking for someone that was the true king of the Jews. Again, a little bit of historical context here. Herod the king was actually appointed to become king. His father actually was identified as the procurator of Judea by Julius Caesar in 47 BC. And one of the first acts of his dad was actually making Herod the governor of Galilee that same year. And in 40 BC, he was named king of Judea by the Roman Senate. And then it took him 3 years, but finally in 37 BC, he secured Jerusalem. See, he wasn't truly a king of Israel. He wasn't truly king of the Jews. He was actually an outsider in many ways. He was an Edomite. And if you understand the term of the Edomite, is actually when you have the account of Jacob and Esau. Esau was the son that sold his birthright, and Jacob was the one that captured it, took it away from him. And the Edomites were those that followed after Esau. He was a supplanter. And you wonder if they saw him as a false king. And so when they saw the wise men, that they're looking at the fact that they were a threat against him, this king that would be born of the Jews, because he was only half Jewish. And there's an incredible parallelism there. Here you have Herod, whose mother was she was Jewish, but the father was Edomite. And here you have Jesus, whose mother was Jewish, but his true father was creator of the universe. The true father was God himself. And you have to wonder also, the second half of Numbers 24 played in the back of the mind, because we said before, a star shall come out of Jacob and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. But then it says in verse 18, and Edom shall be disposed. Seir, which is the capital of Edom, also his enemies shall be disposed. Did the wise men know Herod was not the true king? Well, you could argue that they're learned men and there's politics involved, and they may recognize the history behind Herod, and so it might be a little bit of a stab at him. It's possible. But this is what we know. Look at verse 3. It says, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. He was agitated. They are coming for me. If you're ever growing up, you ever played, especially on the snowbanks, you ever played King of the Hill, right? You're standing up there on the snowbank and all these kids are rushing at you and your job is to push them down as fast as you can. And you always have this sense of Herod the king that he sees any type of person that's going to agitate him and he's actually going to push them down. Any challenge is thrown, he's going to dispose of them as quickly as possible. In fact, we know that actually to be true. That's actually who Herod was. Herod was one who was weary of other people and weary of what other people would do. But what he did was, and we see this historically, okay? Even though he was a good king, he was a king that was, even though he was a king that did magnificent things, he was a king that was extremely paranoid, and he was a king that was in many ways narcissistic. How do we know this? And I'll say this in a very appropriate way with some of the kids here. But his 18-year-old brother, that he felt a threat from him, and he took care of him. We'll just say he had a swimming accident. He had his mother-in-law of his second wife, he had her taken care of. He had two of his sons taken care of. And Caesar Augustus actually had a play of words, and he said, it's better to be Herod's pig than his son. And he even, when he was getting ready to pass away, he identified a number of men that he also wanted to be taken care of, so that when he actually died, that he said that all of Judea might weep at his passing. Now, when he actually passed away, they did not follow through with his orders, but that shows you the type of person, how he was agitated and why they were worried, and even why all Jerusalem was worried with him, because they knew that they would receive the brunt of whatever he would do. So his later order, even though it's not recorded anywhere in historical documents, but where he says that he orders for that all the babies that were 2 and under born in Bethlehem would be taken care of, it doesn't come as a surprise. This was in his character. This was in his nature. This is who Herod was. But also we see in this passage that even though he was king of Judea, that he also lacked the knowledge, though, of what the scriptures taught. It says in verse 4, he says, he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of all the people. He called the experts, and he inquired of them of where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Herod called an impromptu meeting of experts. He called the chief priests, most likely the Sadducees. He called the scribes, these were the experts of the law, most likely the Pharisees. And he asked them, where would the Christ to be born? Note that he did not make the connection, right? That the king was the Messiah. And so they brought them together, and they actually, a lot of times we reference Micah 5:2, but it's a combination of 2 different passages that they are referencing here. The first one, again, is Micah 5:2, for you shall come forth for me one who's to be ruler in Israel, and he identifies that they're coming from Bethlehem, but it's also referencing one that was said about David. You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. See, David was identified as the shepherd king. And this promise of this true king is one who would be born from Ancient of Days, but also would be one who would shepherd my people. In fact, last week we talked about this when we referenced Ezekiel 34 and how Jesus is the good shepherd who provides for his flock, who provides for his people, that he would feed them, that he will govern them. And so here we see Herod take the next steps. It says in verse 7, then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. right? And he's calling them secretly. Why? Because he doesn't want to create fanfare, but he wants to keep it on the down low. And he needed more information. And in verse 8 it says this, and he sent them to Bethlehem saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I may come and worship him. Right? And we all know like there's kind of almost like a dark, evil voice behind that when he's saying worship him, because he has no intention to worship him. Instead, to take care of the problem, take care of the situation. And it's possible here the wise men may not exactly fully understand and see the duplicity, but we know later that they're warned to leave and go suddenly. And now it's important to recognize is that immediately with the birth of Jesus, you see that the enemy, recognizing that there is an unfolding of a plan that is taking place, and he's attempting to stop it. And it's a reminder to you and I that there is spiritual warfare. It's true and it's real. That when you live your life for Jesus, right, the deceiver seeks to interrupt. That there is a usurper that's present, and he's trying to stop what's actually taking place from happening. And this is really kind of maybe more of a devotional point here, but it's important to consider. See, here in the city of Jerusalem, you have two kings that are present. You have one that's a fake one, and you have one that is true. You have one that's standing in Jerusalem that built this temple that was magnificent, that was world-renowned, but was empty on the inside of any spiritual matter. And you had one that was laying in Bethlehem, that was in a manger, that came for the lowly and for the humble to all man, that is God himself, 100% divine and 100% man. You have one that's paranoid, and you have one that's narcissistic, and you have one that's humble and selfless and will give his life on the cross in order to save the world. And you have one that cared about self-preservation, and you had one that gave it all. And the reality is this: which is the king you're going to follow? The fake king? That's your own desires and your own flesh? That's your own name to lift yourself up and to push anybody down that comes against you, that you got to protect your own at all costs? Or the one true king that calls you to live a life of selflessness, of love, of mercy, of forgiveness, of placing others first? Which one will you follow? There's an organization, a wonderful ministry organization called Crew, and they direct people of how to know Christ as your Lord and Savior. And they talk about within their discussion that really we in our natural state, our sinful state, we live a self-directed life where the S stands for self, and our self stands on the throne, and you see the cross on the outside, and Christ is outside of the life. And talk about our interests are directed by self, by our own purposes, for our own desires. And as a result, it only leads to brokenness, discord, frustration, agitation. But there's another life that God calls you to, and it's one that's Christ-directed life, where Christ is the king. He's sitting on the chair. He's on the throne. And out of that comes a life that knows the joy that comes from him. That life that's filled with love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. It's one that's empowered by the Holy Spirit, where we desire to live our life for his purpose, to serve the one true king that gives meaning and purpose behind everything that we do. And so you have this choice that's kind of presented here in Matthew of the one that's the usurper, that's kind of taken the throne, and the one that deserves the throne and will hold it victoriously. Which one will you follow? As we continue on in the passage, in verse 9, it says this: after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Now, this had to be a tremendous sight. As they continued on their journey, the star directed and shifted place in order to direct them to where the child lay, through the streets of Bethlehem, to a house that the Son of God laid in. And it must have been overwhelming. Now, for us, like, we're used to GPS where they take us take a left and take a right, right? So maybe like we're like, oh, well, it's just directions. Like, no, okay. Even today, we would be like, that's incredible. That's amazing as we're following this light, right? But they rejoice, and it says exceedingly with great joy. And they put so many descriptors in there that there's not enough exclamation point or enough voice inflection to really give an emphasis on the amount of joy that they truly felt in that moment. And they're overwhelmed that this is what we have traveled so many miles for, that they truly found the baby once and for all. Following the star had paid off. That this wasn't some kind of gimmick or parlor trick. Remember that there were astrologers and they're used to following false signs consistently, and they happened to stumble upon a truth. But no, this was something that they could not create, something that they could only give attention to God for doing and for producing. That they recognized that there's something greater that was taking place. Now, some people speculate and they say, well, what was this light? Some people say a supernova or a comet or two planets that happen to give a bright light. But note the description, that the star moved. It went before them. Very similar to Israel when they came out of Egypt and God gave them a fire that led them at night. And this was clearly a supernatural event that they were witnessing. And it says in verse 11, as they're going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. They fell down and they worshiped him. They laid prostrate on the ground with their nose touching the floor in front of them. Again, there's no doubt that this was genuine adoration. They seen the star and it directed them and they were amazed. It says here they presented their gifts. Now, traditionally, even in the song that we sang, there's an idea of that the gold represents the fact that Jesus is king, right? The frankincense has to do with an aroma that they put down that burned incense that was for the priest as part of the sacrifice. And that myrrh is actually an ointment that's used in burial preparation. And this does preach, right? But most likely, like, it's a little bit of reading into it a little bit, even though those things could be used for that purpose. But really, these should be understood simply as gifts of worth and worship. Because even myrrh, I'm not sure if you knew that, even though it could be used for burial, it was also a common spice that was used for joyous occasions. In fact, Proverbs talks about to be used during a wedding. And it's a reminder, right? We need to be careful about tradition that does not supersede, the context or what that is, which is doctrinal truth. Even though I love this layout of what it is, right? And I love singing the song, how beautiful it is. And it's important to us to consider that Jesus is king, that he is priest, that he came to die on the cross and he rose again so that we could have life. All those things are beautiful things. But most likely, it's actually connected to another trip in which we are supposed to draw our attention to. And it's connected to prophecy. The other trip was another son of David, Solomon. When the queen of Sheba came, she brought gifts to welcome and to recognize who he was as king and the wealth that he had. But it's also one that was prophesied. See, in Psalm 72, 8 through 10, it says this: may he have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. May desert tribes bow down before him and his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish and of the coastlands render him tribute. And may the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. Guess where the region is of the wise men, where they're most likely from? From Sheba and Seba. Or back Isaiah 66. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come, and they shall bring what? Gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. See, this is prophecy fulfilled. It's one we actually tend to overlook during Christmas time. But this is actually foretold of what would take place when the Messiah would be there. And they bring good news. And much like the shepherds where they testified of, we were out in the field minding our own business, and a great light, an angel just showed up out of nowhere and said to us, "Fear not, for I bring you tidings of great joy." In the same way that they brought this to Mary and she pondered this within her heart, the same way that these wise men, like all of a sudden we're out there, we see a giant brilliant star show up, and we followed it because we know about this prophecy in Numbers 24. And so we just kept going with it and following it. And then when we got closer, all of a sudden, the star started directing us, and it moved location, and it changed direction, and brought us straight to your house. They brought good news. Again, that this was not an ordinary birth. This was God come in flesh to come to this world to bring the best good news, which is salvation for his people. Salvation, that we may be freed from our sin and to walk in the way of the Lord. Now in verse 12, it kind of wraps up and it says this, "And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way." They were warned not to return, right? And we know later that Herod gave an order to take care of the baby boys. And there's a quote that from exegetical commentary says this: "A major thrust of the first gospel is that when people try to thwart the divine will, God intervenes supernaturally to overcome all such hostile actions." See, we know that the Lord is in control and he guides our paths. The Lord supernaturally intervenes to bring salvation to his people. And the reality is this, that he has supernaturally intervened into your life because he desires for you to know him. And the same gift that he gave then is being offered to you. One of salvation. Now I want you to pay attention to this. The wise men traveled. They gave gifts. They even worshiped. But then they departed. Did they know the one true king? Or did they just look at it as one special night that happened in the course of their life and then went back on to what they were doing? And it's the same question today. Some, even you, go through all the hustle and bustle of Christmas, even taking time to sing Christmas songs that talk about the one true Messiah, which I'm always amazed at Christmas time over secular airwaves, places that you would not expect them to have rocky song the rest of the time that are filled with a message totally contrary to Christianity, would this time of the year play messages that proclaim the Savior's birth and the hope of all mankind, and maybe you find yourself singing along right alongside of with them. And maybe you even take time to recognize the one born in the manger. And you listen to Luke chapter 2 being read with your family. And for kids sometimes, or even teenagers, or maybe even spouses, like, okay, let's get through this so we can get to the presents. But you give homage where it's due. Let's make sure we read this. And so you go through all the hustle and the bustle, even taking time to recognize the one being born. And yet, you still do not have a relationship with the one true king. The wise men probably thought, wow, this is an amazing king the Jewish people have. I'm going to have to follow them on Instagram. They have the truth right in front of them. See, this is not just Israel's king. It was to be their true king. But they walked away from the true king. They recognized the importance of the star, and they followed the star to the one true king, but they walked away to the one to whom the star was pointing. And I would argue and contend that's where some of you are sitting here today. You're fine with marveling at Christmas. But Jesus isn't your true king. See, the wise men were so close to truth, yet they walked away. They departed to their own country. What about you? Did you know that the traditions, the Christmas cheer, are all exist to lead you to the one true King? Will you depart to your own way, full of brokenness, unforgiveness, holding the weight of the world? Or will you stay and worship and be changed forever because of the work that Jesus did? I invite you to come if you want to know Jesus' gift of salvation and the peace that he has for you. We're going to have a final hymn in just a second, and the Lord may move you to respond now. Or he might call on you to respond later during the week. Either way, I'm here up front or I'm here during the week, and I would love to talk with you. But I want to leave you with this truth from Romans chapter 10. It says this, but what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. I invite you this Christmas season, don't just leave the manger where it is, but take the gift that God has intended for you that will change your entire life. Don't be like Herod, that's agitated and has to hold everything in his control to do things his way. But seek the one true King that brings salvation to your soul. Will you trust him today? We'll invite you to stand.